Hello, everybody, and welcome to A Mighty Blaze's Litfic. The Blaze was sparked in 2020 when COVID-19 extinguished the traditional in-person book tour. Our New York Times bestselling authors and co-founders, Jenna Blum and Caroline Levitt, joined forces to promote new books coming out. I am Bo Ellis, a director at The Blaze of social media, a writer myself, and a producer. And this week we have Meghan Riordan Jarvis, who wrote End of the Hour, which is an amazing memoir about what happens when a trauma therapist is traumatized by loss of her own and ends up going to the same treatment she recommends for her patients. And Meghan is an author, podcast host, many-time podcast guest as well, TEDx speaker and psychotherapist specializing in trauma, grief, and loss. She really has had an amazing career that we'll talk about a little bit, that she also tackles in this memoir that came out pretty recently and also is very amazing. And I also love the cover design.
Love the cover.
Yeah, and that was something I was going to ask later, but since I bring it up, in your novel or memoir, you mention that your business cards have the couch on them. Was the cover of this book a direct nod to that, or like kind of part of it?
Oh, that's such a good question. No one asked me that before. You know, the cover was actually the brainchild of Kathleen Harris, who's the executive editor at Zibby Books. We were talking about, for people who've published before, there are publishing houses that give you, an opportunity to talk about your cover, and those that don't. With the Zibby Books, who I've published with, it's a very collaborative process. Everything about the book, you kind of get to put your fingerprints on. And Kathleen said, here's what I'm thinking. I'm imagining a couch with water underneath it. And I was like, no, that doesn't sound right. I didn't have and water features in the book in multiple places. What I was imagining was like, a couch in a living room that has like a puddle underneath it. And then they sent this cover and I was like, oh, this is the cover. And the blue that is on the cover is actually, they couldn't have known this because they've never been in my home, but it's the paint color of the walls in my house, which is pretty extraordinary.
That is, wow. Sometimes I do think things just kind of think up like that, but that is true with regards to publishing. I don't ask most authors about their books, except for the Zibby authors, because I know it's less fun when the answer is like, oh, well, that's what my publisher wanted to have as the cover. And I didn't really get a say on it, but I guess it's fine. Because that's makes me feel sad, because I know so many wonderful books have been slapped with awful covers the author doesn't support.
Yeah, and I'm a first-time author, so I've only heard those stories. But even also the title, I had a working title, which was Chasing Dark Skies, which I was not committed to. I think sometimes, people are trying to be sensitive, like, oh, we know you have your title. It really was just a placeholder. And I think everyone on the Zibby team sat down the weekend that we were trying to generate the title. It was like time to get the title. And everybody put their heads together to try to come up with the right. And in that process, you come up with ones and you're like, that is terrible. There's no way that's going to be the title of the book. But having a say and having a sort of roundtable conversation helped us get to End of the Hour, which is sort of a nod to the end of a therapy hour, but also the fact that the book is about sort of the end of a period of my life, which was when my parents were alive, and, moving on into a period of time when they weren't alive.
Yeah, I didn't think of it as that dual meaning, because I knew End of the Hour referred to like the end of the therapy hour, which is something that I always find funny when it's portrayed in media, because it always seems in media it's like a timer goes off and the therapist is like, get out, in the middle of a very personal story, which has never been my personal experience in therapy.
No, we're watching the clock more carefully than that. Yeah.
Yes, they're always like, if I'm getting into something too heavy near the end, they're like, maybe we're going to save that for next time. So it's a lot more sensitive and caring, at least it should be.
Hopefully.
Yes. But that is that dual meaning of being the end of kind of an hour of your life is also a really beautiful meaning for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was also wondering, I know Zibby Books is known for her tours, so how have you felt on this tour as a first-time author and kind of doing
Yeah.
some different stuff from what you normally do?
Yeah. So I'm in the primary part of my book tour just ended just on Monday, this past weekend, because the book came out November 14th. And I've never been on a book tour before. So it's a pretty wild experience to be in bookstores. And for me, I did a number of private events with people who were enthusiastic about not only reading the book but selling the book, and thinking about activities that sort of connect the book. I've been really lucky that the person whose book came out after mine, just 2 weeks after mine, Emma Gray, her book is called The Last Love Note and is a different kind of grief story. So it's a novel. It's a beautiful novel. It's like, I really hope it gets turned into a movie, because I saw the whole book in my head. But she and I think we were really maybe the only ones who got to partner up and do be in each other's spaces and supporting each other. So I have found I don't know what I thought book tour would feel like. And Zibby has, we went to the Miami Book Fair. So there was like a big author activity where we got to meet other authors. Then there's, something at the Zibby bookstore, which is in LA, which is a tiny little perfect bookstore, where, we filled it up with people and who had questions and bought books. It's a special, you spend so much time on the words, and that's your part. And then you hand over your words, and then it's like other people's job to make a book out of the words. And all those people get together to kind of celebrate all that hard work on the book tour. And I don't know, it felt like a combination between like homecoming, where you're rooting for your home team, and like a wedding where all the people that you care about are coming out because they care about you. It's been a really special and wildly exhausting time, both.
I can see how definitely it's a lot of travel and a lot of discussion, which that's also, it's interesting to interview people about memoirs or even Emma Gray with an almost fiction story, because it feels like I end up knowing a lot about you before you get to know very much at all about me. So I always feel like I'm starting with you kind of on the back foot, because I can now reference like
that's
a
right.
childhood memory of yours. But has it been challenging to discuss the book for that reason?
No, I mean, I had this one moment that we had an event here in DC. It was the first event. It was right before the book came out. And, I was like nervous for lots of reasons. But I was sitting down with my good friend, Scott Stossel, who was the editor at The Atlantic for a long time. And he's just an incredible conversation partner. So I felt really comfortable about what he was going to ask. But at one point I looked out at the room and everybody was like holding their books. And there was like my across the street neighbor, who I think the bulk of the conversation that he and I have had was about lawnmowers. Like, he knows my husband a little bit better than me. But I was like, oh, and here he is holding my book. I'm like, so he's going to know some things after he finishes that book if he reads it. And I hadn't really, I gave the book to people that are in it. I had given it to relatives to make sure that everybody felt comfortable. And then I was just sort of like, well, now the book is going to be in the world. But somehow having my neighbor hold the book, I was like, oh, that's what that means. Like, your neighbor can know about, how you screamed at your husband and locked him out of the house. So that was a little bit vulnerable. I have had really incredible conversations with people when I'm doing book signings about their experience with loss. Particularly hearing lots and lots of stories about people whose parents have died and where they are in that process. And, that's really intimate and beautiful and hard, because it pulls up your empathy. And, even though this person's sort of a stranger, they've read your books, they feel like they know you. And then they share their story real quick while you're signing, and it's not enough. It's not
Yeah.
it's like you want to get coffee and really like hash it out, but you can't do that with every single thing. So it's both really, really, really rewarding and lovely, and also like weirdly kind of frustrating and like vulnerable in that way. Yeah.
No, that's always an interesting thing of memoirs, is that I think they are so beautiful. I don't know if I could ever write one.
I never intended to write one,
Yeah.
so
But the way they give people such a real thing to connect to,
yeah.
because they can see their life reflected in somebody else's journey and think, and take something from that. And even if all they take is a feeling of not being alone,
Yeah.
that's really enough to justify
It is.
it being out there.
It is. It is. I mean, I say that a lot, particularly because I think most memoirs have a thread of loss. I think there's grief in almost every true story. Maybe in order to make it compelling, we need to see the character go through something.
Yeah.
But I also think we don't talk enough about grief and loss openly. And so I feel like memoir is this one place where it's reliable, that you can go to. You can go to the section in the library about memoir and just pull up a story where you're going to be met and held and validated in your own experience. And so when people are, I'm not sure the world needs my story, I'm like, we probably do though, because we do so little actual direct talking about our feelings that we're probably going to need everybody's story about grief and loss for other people to connect to.
Yeah, and that's something, speaking to Emma Gray, and who's also of Zibby Books, and Susan Huhn, who is a different memoir writer who wrote about losing her husband at a younger age. It's been interesting to talk about just how we don't handle grief well in American society or Australian society, where Emma is from.
Right. I would say not globally, but because there are other cultures that do a better job. But
and it's interesting to me, and I was wondering, as somebody with a more professional background in studying grief, why do you think our culture is so not great at this particular thing that is such a part of life?
I think if you were to look if we did like an anthropological like excavation of how did we get here in the grief space, I think one of the things that we would see is that we removed death from the home and we kind of hospitalized it and put more medicine towards the end of life than used to be the case, that people used to give birth in the home and they used to die in the home, and that allowed the process of both birth and death to be just part of life that we saw and that we participated in and that other people saw, even children saw. But now we have this, like, it's not just American, it may also be Australian, kind of ethos that like dying is a form of failing at life. Right. And right, instead of just like dying is the next developmental stage in life. So I think we're wired. I think our bodies, which are built to survive, are wired to want to push away from and remove itself from anything that feels threatening, and that death is the most threatening thing. So I think instinctively we have a part of us that's like, don't go anywhere near what that is. And then I think we have had this sort of cultural shift to death is a private thing, not a event that happens in the home. I mean, there are still, like in the country of Ireland, they still have Irish wakes, and an Irish wake means they bring the body to the pub. It is not uncommon in the United States for a wake to no longer even include a viewing of a dead body. So we're really death phobic in that way. And like, I'm a social worker. I went back to school for 2 years. I have 2 different master's degrees. I have hundreds of hours of clinical training in very specific types of treatment. Never once in all of my education was I required to take a single class on death or loss or grief. Not once. And as far as I know, my business partner and I checked this out. There are some programs that do require it, but they don't they don't require it with the level of intensity that you would expect, considering every single human will grieve and experience profound loss at some point in their life. And that as a clinician, every single clinician will be showing up for some version of that as a clinician. And we do know training. So I'm not exactly sure why that is, but I do think that Americans have this culture of wanting to kind of win and succeed and do better. One of the things that happens a lot is I will put something on my Instagram about how like I'm kind of not doing great. I'm sort of sucking at the day. And I say that, because sometimes we suck. And without fail, people will say, you're doing the best you can. And my whole point of my post is I'm not doing the best I can. I'm choosing to not try any harder. I'm just going to kind of suck at the day. And that makes people so uncomfortable. They have to be like, nope, I know you think you're getting a B minus, Meghan, but really your B minus gets an A for an effort grade. And I used to kind of argue about it, and now I don't. I don't think that we need to constantly be winning or striving. And I think the discomfort around death is that there's nothing to win or strive. It's just something we have to be with and experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's something I've seen. I have a chronic illness, and so I've spent a lot of times in online health spaces, which can be a mixed bag of different types of people. But there is also this judgment I've seen because I got it quite young as a teenager. And there's always this judgment of like, well, what did you do to make that happen?
Oh, yeah.
And it's this idea of like, well, if I always exercise and eat the perfect diet and have money and do this or that, then I'll never get sick and I'll never die because I'm making the good choices and the right choices, and the sick people are making the wrong choices.
God, I wish that was the way the world works. Kate Bowler talks about this a lot. She's sort of the foremost expert on the prosperity Bible, which is what we're talking about, which is if you make good choices and you please the gods that be, that you will be given goodness. But like, then how do you explain, an infant having leukemia? Like that is, we know that's not the way the world works, but we would like to believe that it's the way the world works. And, there's a lot of luck and there's a lot of being in the right place at the right time, or it's not to say that people aren't working hard and trying hard, but this is going to seem like a tangent. But one of the conversations I have often now with folks, because I work with people who are suffering physically with grief symptoms. And so that suffering can look like not sleeping, not eating. One of the things that's super painful for people, when you're not able to eat, you tend to lose weight. When you lose weight, people say you look great. Doesn't even matter whether you needed to lose weight. So imagine, your partner dies, you can't eat, which is a standard thing that happens. And when I say you can't eat, I mean your body rejects food. You can't eat. And then people are like, wow, you look real good. Like that is horrifying. And one of the things that's an interesting conversation that's happening right now is around some of the weight loss drugs, which are, working with a certain amount of science, whether people think they're good or bad. They are allowing people who have historically had a lot of trouble to be at whatever weight they want, to drop weight, because they're causing bodies to process food differently that don't process food that way. And what's interesting about it is where then goes the like, well, if you just ate better and just exercised more, where goes the judgment, right? Just as we were talking about with the chronic health stuff. People would like to believe that only lazy people who eat, peanut M&Ms end up having difficulty with their weight. And in grief and loss, it's very, very similar. A lot of what I write about in the book is, even though I knew everything, because I've been studying grief and loss basically since I could crack open a book, I've been working with really significantly grieving clients for 20 years. And, and had professional certifications in all of these things. My experience with my mother's death was that it almost immediately made me ill. And that my body's response to that was beyond what I could help myself, even with all my skills and abilities. So part of the reason I wanted to write the book was to say, you can judge me if you want to. But I think what I'm trying to show you is grief is going to do what it's going to do.
Yeah, which is why I really loved reading this, because it's a very intense and real portrait of grief. And I loved also you tackling the physical symptoms that come with it, because we don't think about that. And even that you mentioned that you got surfer's ear, which is a condition I hadn't heard of
Yeah,
before. And you
me
think
either.
it was a lot due to grief, which when you described how that surgery went, I messaged my friend who is a doctor and I was like, "Is this real? This happens? This is what they do?" And she was like, "Yep." So I was like, "Oh my god, that is so scary to just
Yeah.
read."
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing, which again, this is not something that people generally know. And
Mhm,
while I knew this intellectually, I understood it, the knowing of it didn't stop the
mhm,
impact of it on my system. But we have 12 different cranial nerves in our brain that send
mhm,
information down into our body. One of those nerves is a superhighway. So it sends messages down, but it can also bring messages up. And our body is built of 12 systems. So the digestive tract, the reproductive tract, the muscular skeletal, the what's there's 12 of them, the
mhm,
augmentary, which is your skin and your nails and your hair. There's a whole each one of those systems can be impacted by grief and loss.
mhm,
So it is not uncommon for people to have really dry, brittle skin and have their hair fall out. But
mhm.
people who have had really dry, brittle skin and their hair fall out come into my office and say, I don't know what's wrong with me. This has been going
Yeah.
on for X number of months. And I say, what happened X number of months ago? And they say, well, my mother died, but I don't think it's connected. And for me, that's really heartbreaking because
Mhm,
they've been feeling afraid of their own body. You referenced in my book this crazy condition that I end up developing, which
mhm,
is a bone, these series of bones grow across my ear, surfer's ear. And here's the thing, even though I was like, how can this be happening?
mhm,
I actually understood that one of the responses that happens in the body has to do with your muscular skeletal system.
mhm.
And so that was for me, my back went out and I grew some bones in my ear. So my what was being impacted for me most significantly was my digestive tract. I really couldn't eat. Some of my hormones were out of whack, so my hippocampus was um really having trouble, and also this muscular skeletal system. And the reason I like to talk about this so much is I don't want people to be afraid. I want them
Mhm.
to say, "Oh, yeah, no, you know what? Throwing your back out or having muscle pain or aches or migraines or that's all just a standard grief response. And here's how we end up treating it." But at the time, it was pretty wild
Mhm.
because the symbolism behind bones growing across my ears so that I was they were beginning
Yeah.
to include my hearing, so they were growing together. The doctor, I write it in the book, the doctor literally is like, is listening an important part of your job?
Which
I typed this to my best friend and she's like, I feel like this plot is being really like hammered. This
Mhm,
idea of like a traumatized trauma therapist is we're taking
mhm.
it a touch too far.
Yeah, that's I really love that joke in your book, because I found that so often where things will happen in my life or in my friend's life and it's like, this feels so
Yeah.
coincidental, so like somebody else is writing a story and making a kind of metaphor, and it's just
Yeah.
like it feels ridiculous when you take a step back from it.
Right. You're a writer. It's like if you were in a writer's room, the writers would be like, it's too much. No one will
Yeah.
believe. The plot line is like too heavy-handed. You can't add
Mhm,
that in. Except that's really what happened. I really grew bones across my ears that were stopping me from being able to hear
mhm.
when I was trying to, figure out whether or not I should go back to work.
Yeah, which I think that is also a good part of memoirs. In fiction, you have to make sure everything you're writing is reasonable, or people will
Yes.
be like, "This is unrealistic." But
Correct.
in memoirs, you can just tell a true story, which often has a lot of things that are unrealistic and unreasonable happening.
That's right. That is right. I mean, there's a chapter that's not in the book, but it's like out there on the internet. I wrote it as a short story that after my mom died, one of the things I had to do her little old lady friends, which we call the LOLs, the League of Old Ladies, that they told me, like, just go to this grocery store, and at that grocery store, just tell them you want the funeral luncheon for 120. So that's it. Like, just go there. It's pre-ordered. It's like getting a Happy Meal. You write a check and you come home. And I was like, great. That's just about what I can do. And I got there and I had an appointment and I got there and it was like Linda, the lady from the catering, had an emergency. So instead I had Carol from Flowers. And Carol from Flowers had never done this before. So I was like, I would like the funeral luncheon for 120. And she was like, yeah, I don't know what that means. We just need to click through and figure out what you need. And so it was like a live fourth grade math problem over and over and over again. It was like, would you like a tray of chicken salad sandwiches? And I'm like, okay, sure. Let's have a tray of chicken salad sandwiches. And she would be like, how many? And I'm like, I don't know, 120. And she's like, you think that every person is going to eat a chicken salad sandwich? I'm like, I don't know. They're not going to. I have no idea.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you skip to the end and it's like I had under-ordered sandwiches, over-ordered cookies by like 150 because I couldn't do math. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't. And when it all happened, what was the most ridiculous part of the story is we got to the end and the little old ladies, my mother's friends, had said, make sure to get tea. All these little old ladies like tea. So we had ordered coffee and ordered like 1,000 creamers because the creamers came in a box of like 1,000. And I'm sweating and I'm drinking iced tea and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this is what's really happening. Like if I were to write this as a short story, I wouldn't be able to believe it. We get to the part with the tea and Carol from Flowers says to me, do you want to get milk? And I was like, Carol, we just ordered 1,000 creamers. I think and she said, well, some people feel very strongly about milk in their tea over creamers. And I was like, you mean like this was a terrible, I used the F word, a terrible effing funeral because I didn't have milk for my tea, Carol? And she was like, I get your point. And then at the funeral, all that came were the creamers. There was no coffee and no tea. And like if we wrote it as a play or a scene in a TV show, the writers would be like, cut that scene. It's too ridiculous. But it's what actually happened. And a lot of what happens because your emotions are so overwrought and intense, a lot of what happens seems completely inane.
Yeah. No, I can't imagine. I also can't imagine anyone going to a funeral and being like, this really isn't what I'd prefer for tea, but
that was my point. Carol was like, well, some people really prefer it. I'm like, yeah, we're not catering someone's bat mitzvah here.
Yes.
I don't care if we get negative Yelp reviews about my mother's funeral not having the right tea. I'm just, no, I don't care.
No, it is always amazing the things life will throw at you and you're like, how is this what's happening? The opposite of what I need right now.
That's right. And I think grief and loss, I really do, because a lot of what happens when you're grieving is it's almost like you're laden with heavy things. Like you're walking around with just like this burden on top of you. And so it's hard to do just like the regular stuff of like combing your hair and taking a shower. And then the things that are asked of you in the moment, and particularly at a funeral or a reception, like you have to talk to your grade school teacher, or you have to, have small talk with your ex-boyfriend's mother. Like the things that you're asked to do at this time that's already so hard are often, they're insane. And if you can really kind of embrace it, they can be really ridiculous and funny as well.
Yeah, it's definitely something you have to, but it's so hard to get when you're struggling into a mindset of saying, wow, I can't believe this is happening. It's kind of funny. Or maybe you just slip into that because it's so easy to.
Yeah. The neural pathways for real sorrow and anxiety are very close to the neural pathways for absolute hysteria. So I have collected over the years, and I actually put this in the book, my own experience being in the funeral home. I have so many stories of people like they they were like crying, and then they didn't mean to, but all of a sudden they were hysterically laughing. That is a common experience for folks, is that like the sorrow and the humor, the like ridiculousness are so close together that people, and you know, sometimes like me in the book, I mean, I ended up hysterically laughing in the funeral home and being yelled at by my younger sister. But that is, I put a lot of those stories in the book because they are my personal examples of the stories that I've heard from clients over the years. A client telling me I laughed kind of inappropriately and couldn't stop is a story I've heard many, many times.
And that reminds me of also you mentioning when you got the news of the death and that you heard this from clients before, that you get like a strange like surge of adrenaline that almost feels like excitement, and that it makes some people feel really weird and bad about like, why did I feel happy? And some people interpret it as like, oh, it was like it was like a spiritual experience, like the love of God rushing over me from them.
Absolutely. I love that you asked this question. Actually, it's in the book, but you're the first person to ask about it. I put this in deliberately because it's something that I've experienced multiple times in my life, in a moment that is untenable, that's going to crack my life in two, that is terrible. I have felt a surge of what sort of, I think maybe I call it joy or excitement in the book. And I carried that around. I think I had an example of something bad happening to a friend and feeling that sensation. And then also when my grandfather died, feeling that sensation, I carried it around and was sort of like, maybe I am just like a terrible person who has the wrong kind of reaction. But I asked a neuroscientist about it long time ago. And she said very plainly, like, oh, that's just adrenaline. Like that absolutely happens. And that happens in illness, and it happens before a fever, and it happens before people get chemo. Like your body is bracing for this terrible thing that it can see it's anticipating this thing right on the horizon. And then I knew that, and I had that sort of like in the back of my head, but I didn't talk about it to other people because I still sort of felt like, I think maybe I'm a bad person who feels this way. And I give one example in the book, but I have hundreds of examples of asking clients about it. Did you have any strange physical sensations? I had one client tell me that he almost felt like aroused. And I was like, I understand what you're talking about. It's this inappropriate energy that feels like it's trying to take care of you or rescue you in the moment. So thanks for asking about it, because I put it in there really intentionally. And I was a little bit worried, like, wow, this is going to sound like I was excited that my mother died, but I think I wrote it in a way to sort of try to explain the neuroscience behind it. And I have had a number of people reach out to me and say, no one's ever told me about this before, and I had similar experience.
Yeah, it's something that I found really interesting reading it because I'd never heard of it before. And I am definitely no stranger to feeling like I had a very strange reaction to bad news, and then feeling like, oh, I must just be a really terrible person who is wired wrong. I don't respond appropriately to things, and I don't know why. So reading like, oh, there's actually reasons for why people do these things. And it doesn't mean that you are a terrible person who can't respond appropriately to things.
Well, and the other thing that's true, which I talk a little bit about, is that, you know, there's a difference between emotions and feelings. Emotions are just these little electrical currents that kind of light up our bodies in different ways. And then we make those emotions, when they cluster, if we have a bunch of them all at once, we kind of assign a meaning to them. And we say, oh, that pit in my stomach is because I'm unhappy. But the thing is, we're not always right about that. Like my assignment of the feeling word to the emotional experience is only as good as I am in terms of identifying my emotions. So I think it's also important, you know, there are a lot of people out there that feel like crap because they had different emotions. And, you know, emotions are a little bit like the weather. Like we don't judge the wind for blowing. And every time there's a puff of wind, it doesn't mean there's going to be a storm. But people will, you know, they'll feel relief, or they'll feel anger, or they'll feel, you know, some other feeling that they if they were scripting a version of themselves reacting to bad news, they would not include this because it doesn't make them feel good about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is one thing I also wanted to ask. This sort of leads into, you included so many important things in this memoir that I think will hopefully help a lot of people. And I think have just helped me, if not just educating me for the future. What made you finally decide to write a memoir and to end up submitting it and, getting in touch with Zibby and all of that?
Yeah, I didn't do any of those things. I didn't decide to write
Yeah.
a memoir. I didn't submit it, and I didn't get in touch with Zibby. So
Mhm.
I happen to have one of those stories that I always feel sheepish about telling it, because this is the kind of story that if I heard it, I'd be like, well, screw her. Like, she's just lucky.
Yeah.
Zibby started what to me was a life-saving book club. Her
Mhm.
book club was on Tuesdays during the pandemic. My mother died in August before the pandemic, and then I came back out into the world in January. So I was in the world having had this terrible experience with PTSD. So it was January, February, March, then the world shut down. And then Zibby started her book club. And every week we read a book that was a memoir primarily. I think we read a couple of novels, but it was mostly a
Mhm.
memoir. And then the author would come to the book club and we could ask them questions. And to me, it was like the one piece of structure. And it was something I hadn't done in a long time, like
Mhm.
read intensely. And in the process of that, Zibby's mother-in-law died of COVID.
Mm.
Very unexpectedly. She was young, she was healthy, she had been taking care of her own mother who died of COVID. And she died really unexpectedly. And so then my conversations with Zibby were more important and personal about what was happening in her own life and the books that we were reading. And
Mhm.
I happened to be journaling and writing. I had a blog at this point that was as sophisticated as I had gotten, which was mostly being read by my 9 Facebook friends. I wasn't even on Instagram. I
Yeah.
just was, relatives and
Mhm.
friends from high school. And about a year after I had been in the book club, I wrote the footer at the bottom of my blog said, Meghan is working on a memoir. And that was just like an aspirational. I had had the experience of writing for myself, just sort of getting my own thoughts and feelings out onto paper, which was very much a therapeutic process that I took from being in treatment.
Mhm.
And I started to really appreciate people responding to what I was writing. That took my own sort of healing to another level. And I thought, well, if my healing can help other people, maybe
Mhm.
it's worth thinking about this as a book. And very shortly thereafter, Zibby sent me an email. It was like a one-line email that said, "Do you think you have a memoir in you?" And I showed it to my husband and was like, "What do you think this means?" And my husband was like, "I think it means exactly what it says."
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of my beginning of writing my book was Zibby's beginning of starting a publishing company. And so I wrote a book and she started a company. And then when I had a draft done, she
Mhm.
supported that with I had an editor that she supported. She paid for to work with me to sort of teach me how to use grammar again and teach me how to write, an arc. But I was
Mhm.
never, I never queried a agent. I never sent in. I've never done that. Actually, I've never.
Mhm.
I have 2 other books that are out in. One is coming out in October. That's a clinical book, and
Mhm.
I didn't go through the normal process with that either.
Yeah. Well, I get how some people might feel like, oh, wow.
I
I
would
wish
be
I,
really annoyed at
yeah.
myself. If I heard this story, I'd be like, well, that she did not help me. And she's just one of those people that got super lucky. And that is how I'm jealous of myself in that way. Like I did not, the risks that people have to take with their writing to sort of submit it and put it out there and like, oh my God, I'm going to be rejected. I did not have to do that with this book.
Mhm.
That was not part of this road. I've done that to some degree with other writing. Um,
Mhm.
but this memoir was just held very closely by a team that Zibby built around her from the very beginning. And every part of it, every part of creating the book was as sort of networked and supported as I could possibly, I think as a person could possibly have.
Yeah. And that's something, honestly, I wish more authors could experience all of them, because I think writing is so personal and beautiful. I wish it was overall a little more supportive of a process to get
Yeah.
published rather than
I
so.
joke, I'm the author Christy Tate is a friend of mine, and she and I are in this little like I guess I would say like support group. And I joke that there should be like a course, kind of like when you're about to have a baby, you can take a class that teaches you about everything that's hard about having a baby. That before you go to submit or query, I feel like there should be a class that sort of is like, look, you're doing the right thing. It's very hard. It's very difficult. The process of making a book is sort of nutso, and look, the process of making a book is nutso. A lot of hours and effort go into making a book, and then the average book doesn't sell a gajillion copies and get turned into a movie. So it is a very and not that many books get published. So it's an extraordinary effort. It's very heroic when people are trying to get their stories out into the world, and we absolutely need those stories. So it's everything about the process is hard, and I wish there was a way to make it easier. I have a hunch that the reason it isn't easier is that there's value in something about the hard, that people, particularly memoirists, are digging into a whole nother level to get their stories out there. Certainly that's been my experience with my friends and colleagues, is watching them do it and being like, well, you got to really want it, because it's not usually a magical Cinderella story like the one that I got to have, that Zibby gave me.
Yeah, and that's something that it's been very interesting with the memoir and some of the oldest almost fiction
Yeah.
authors I have spoken to, and that I think is brave in a way that even more brave to me than fiction writers like myself, which I don't mean as any insult to fiction writers, but to really have like, this is literally about me, and I am putting it out there for people to read and judge and take away whatever on earth they will take away from it, which may not be anywhere close to what I meant when I was putting it on the page. I think it's a really brave thing to put a story out there with the hope that there's going to be somebody who reads it and says, I get exactly what this is, and it was exactly what I needed to read, or this really will help me, or maybe it doesn't help them when they read it, but they can come back to it at a different stage in life and connect then.
I think the thing I was most worried about was accidentally hurting people I care about with my writing, and my desire to put the story out there. I'm really careful. I don't use any of my siblings' names, and there are just entire elements to both the deaths of my parents that I just don't write about, because I wanted to be careful not to. But having said that, I bet I did. I bet there are people who were hurt and didn't find themselves, or didn't find my versions of the stories accurate. The thing about I joked about this with Zibby when I was at the Miami Book Fair. I was like, I really didn't like books that were like about a woman sort of, locked in the bathroom crying on the floor. But of course, her memoir includes that, and mine, I'm not in a bathroom, but I'm in my basement.
Yeah.
I just don't love that you have to like kind of nearly die in a story, maybe your own life story, in order to make significant change. But also, I do know that often pain is the thing, is the still point that invites us into change. And I think for me, the writing of the book, the vulnerability really more was to my inside community. The book is out there. There's comments about it, people, and if folks have listened to it, I love to get reviews on Goodreads and Amazon. I'm really grateful for those. But the ones where people say this story wasn't for me, I liked a different book better, I feel almost nothing about that, honestly. So the fact that you can kind of end up feeling reviewed or judged by other people, that I feared that, and that hasn't been what has happened. That the negative comments, or the things where people say this book just didn't work for me, those are less important to me than the stories that people have been telling me, and the comments and the reviews where people say this is exactly the book that I needed. And I mean, I'm not just saying that, that is really genuinely true. I was terrified that I was going to have put myself in this really vulnerable position and that it was going to dysregulate me and make me feel unwell. And that's not what happened. Instead, I'm just like, I'm glad that my words are meaningful to people in a way that allow them to feel comfort.
Yeah. And I'm really glad for that, because it's a thing where it's like, I have never been in the position and don't know if it would be the same way. So it's good to hear that it can be something you're afraid of, and then you get to it and you're like, actually, not that. Not the thing I was worried about.
Yeah. And the thing about writing a book is, and I've heard other authors say this, and I can just attest that it's true. I started writing this book over 3 years ago. So I've spent a lot of time with the reality of the words and the pages. I read it out loud for the audio version. You really it's not like you write it in a journal and then all of a sudden it gets published and you're like, oh my God, but I barely meant what I said. Like, you have really come to terms with what you are putting out there by the time it's put out there. So for people who right now who are like, oh, I don't think I could do it, you don't have to publish a memoir. You don't have to publish it. Go ahead and write it. Write your story if you think your story has something to say. And just know there's a lot of breaks in the process. There's a lot of time to say, I don't want to put this in here. I don't want to put this out in the world. But for people who are interested in telling their story, I think part of the reason you're interested in telling it is that there's people out there whose ears need to hear it. Because not everybody says, oh, I think I'll write a memoir. There's a whole lot of folks that are like, I would never write a memoir. So for those folks who are thinking about it, there may be a reason you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice for anybody listening to just really give it a shot, which is what I wish. And I'm not great at doing this myself, but I wish for everybody that we would just be willing to kind of jump into things a little bit more, because I think it would give us all just a lot more creative works of art in the world. And that's always a good thing to me.
Yeah. And for me, I mean, this is going to seem ridiculous, but my book is about just the lowest point in my life, where I'm not able to really eat or sleep or take care of my children or do my job. So there is something really empowering about surviving that kind of a moment, right? Like so to me, like, well, whatever, I can write a book and let people say whatever it is that they're going to say, because I already did something way harder than that. And to some degree, I do something really hard all the time, which is, and people may listen to this and say, that's not that hard, but I lived 45 years with my mother as a backstop to everything that I did. I just went on this big book tour. It was so exciting. I met so many people. Extraordinary things happened. Every day I would get back to my hotel room and be like, damn it, I wish I could call her. Because her excitement about things that were exciting for me, it was almost like a tumble dry. We would just go over the details and she would be thrilled and she would love that for her life. And it would make me feel like I was doing the right thing in my life. And every time I think, oh God, I could call her and I can't call her, is, another moment where I'm like, oh no, this is what's brave for me. Telling the story of the real things that happened. That's brave-ish. What feels braver is like still continuing to not know exactly how I'm going to go forward in life without her. And it's 4 years and I still do it every day. I still go through life without her.
That is something that I personally haven't experienced, but I know from reading about it
right? I mean, most of us will. You never know what lap you're on, right? You never know what other lap somebody's on. We never wish the hardship of it, but it's pretty typical. So what part of the reason I write in the book, about my experiences, it's pretty typical to lose your parents. In fact, that's probably the way it's supposed to go. And for me, it was unbearably hard, so much harder than I ever expected. Yeah.
And I think it's beautiful to share that with the world, because I think, like you said, we don't talk about grief, and it's like we're setting ourselves up in a society obsessed with winning. We are setting ourselves up for a sort of failure with grief, because we don't tell people this is going to be so hard. It's going to be harder than you ever imagine. And
Yeah.
you're going to have to find a way.
Yeah, you know, I have a consulting company, and my business partner and I talk to companies, big companies. And many of them, when we ask them how long their bereavement leave is, you know, how many days off, you know, we wonder where we get the messages. Bereavement leave, like good bereavement leave is 3 days. 3 days. Like if your mother died in Milwaukee, you may not be able to even get there and back in 3 days. You're still going to have to take some personal time. And companies are often really reluctant to shift that, but they're reluctant to shift it because we live in a culture that lets them be reluctant to shift it. You know, and there's, you know, it's not just bereavement leave, it's also family leave and maternity leave and paternity leave. But part of the reason that we think it's not as hard as it is that Bob's brother died and he was back on Monday.
Yeah.
He was left early on Friday and now he's back on Monday. That's not because Bob wants to be back, and is not because Bob thinks it's okay to be back, and he certainly does not want to be working. I mean, maybe he does. Some people love to go back to work because it's a distraction. Yeah. But the symbolism behind it, if we're looking, where do we get these ideas? Well, we get these ideas on television, which makes grief look like it's, you know, a funny plot point so that Sarah Jessica Parker can start dating somebody else, or you know, it's a plot point that shows you that the character is gonna, you know, go crazy instead of. There are some TV shows that show us the reality of it, but they're not very many. And so we don't know what to think about it. We don't know what is it, how much time does it take? So part of what we do, why I do what I do, and a lot of the reason why I wrote the book is I just, you know, I say to people, look, it took me 6 months to be able to sleep through the night. And I was working as hard as I could with really top-notch therapists. And I feel like it's important for folks to know that that's how hard it can be. Like, I'm not that uncommon. That's how hard loss really can be.
And I did love that this book highlights all the many different ranges of therapeutic things, because people often think of therapy, they think talk therapy, and they don't really know that there's so many different things in the world of therapy that they can go to if they felt like talk therapy has never been effective for them. There's other stuff that you can give a shot that might work a little better.
So what I talk about as a clinician is there's actual treatments, right? So like if you had tennis elbow, you could go to a doc. You would wait like a week and your elbow would hurt and you'd be like, I need to see a doctor about this. You go to the doctor and say, is it tennis elbow? And the doctor would say, well, we have ways of checking. Let's do the diagnostics. Yes, you have tennis elbow. Here is how we treat tennis elbow. So there's a talking element, but then there's the like physical therapy of the rehabbing of the elbow. And we have that in therapy as well. So there is the kind of come sit on my couch and tell me your problems. There's that talk element. But when you're dysregulated, when your body is having all of these reactions, which it will, because we experience the world with our 5 senses and we filter grief with our body, we have all these treatments. And so what I write about are the treatments. What are how do we bring the body back into a state of kind of calm? And most people have never checked themselves into a world-class trauma facility. Most people don't go see a trauma therapist. So part of the reason I write about those treatments is so that they know that they'll exist, that they know that they exist, and that they know that they're treatments for, profound trauma and grief. I think we do a better job about talking about trauma, but I don't think that helps people find the kind of treatment that they need. I mean, one question that I often get asked is like, well, since you had all this education and you knew all these things and you had been working in the field, like, did that give you a leg up? And as I've said, it didn't, except that I knew exactly where the best treatment was and I knew how to access it. It did give me a leg up in that way. I knew that I needed the treatment. I knew that my symptoms were getting worse and not better. I wasn't confused about whether I should just wait it out and see if it went away. I understood I need treatment, I need help, and I knew where to get it. And that often for my clients, that's what they struggle with. They struggle, it's hard to make a phone call when you're not feeling yourself, and to make a phone call to a therapist or a treatment facility and then not have them call you back is like heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And you gotta, a week could go by before you feel like you can take that risk again.
And it is it is something that also is why I'm glad this book is out there, and hopefully somebody reads it and realizes there are these options out there for them. And I love this interview and feel like it could go on forever, but I do have to wind
Yes,
it down.
yes, we have to wind it down. Thank you so much, Bo.
Yeah, and there's one thing I always like to ask, which is there anything that I should have asked or that you wanted to talk about that we didn't quite get to here?
No, I the only thing that I often say about this book is that I write about my dad's death, which is more typical. It's more the kind of grief that people experience, and it feels sad and hard, but it doesn't kind of like knock you off your rocking horse. And then I also write about my mom. So if people aren't sure when they're listening to this interview, like, well, what does she mean? The book is designed to help you kind of find your own grieving inside the story. Am I more like the person who it's going to be hard, but I can do it, like a sprained ankle that's going to heal on its own? Or is it more like an infection that needs some kind of medical intervention? And what I show you is both kinds of grieving. When my dad died, it was hard and sad. When my mom died, I got ill.
That is a very, I didn't think about how the book was structured like that, but that's also a really great
It was
facet.
really intentional
Yeah.
to sort of show people the difference between the two experiences.
And also, what are you doing next and where can people find you?
Yeah, so come find me on Instagram. That's the platform I'm on the most reliably. Meghan Riordan Jarvis. If you want to ask me questions, you can Google my name and go to my website. I have a bunch of book things that are happening, and I'll put them up on Instagram. Some of them are private events, some of them are bookstore related, and I think I do one a month, like until May or June. So you can still come out and find the book. And I'm about to teach a class in the new year about ruminations, about the way in which we kind of think in a loop. So if people are struggling with their thinking, the kind that's like, what if, why didn't I, if only, I'm going to teach a class about how to manage ruminations. And that is, we don't have the dates for that yet, but just come find me on IG and I'll update you on all of this.
And Meghan's IG, her website, and a link to buy her book are all in the comments. So please absolutely check those out. And thank you to everybody who joined us. And thank you so much to Meghan. And like, follow, and subscribe for more blazing goodness and more amazing authors like Meghan.
Thank you so much for all that you do on this platform. I've been following this platform since it started, and it is just a place of such goodness.
Thank you. And thank you again. We'll see you all soon.